Let's start with the question of where does money come from? And the answer to this should seem obvious because it's written on every single banknote that you see, the central bank of Iceland. But that's not quite the whole story. The truth is that the central bank only actually creates a small percentage of all the money that exists. It's actually just 3% of all the money in the economy that comes from the central bank. So where does the other 97% come from? Well, what normally surprises people is that most of the money that exists is created by banks. It's the big banks that everybody knows and recognizes. So 97% of all the money in the economy is not created by the government or the central bank. It's actually created by the commercial banks. Now, usually when I say this, people don't really believe me the first time. So I just want to show you some people from central banks who have confirmed that this is the way the system works. This is the governor, so the chief executive of the Bank of England, Sir Mervyn King, saying that when banks extend loans to their customers, they create money by crediting their customers' accounts. So when you go into a bank and take out a loan to buy a house that's already too expensive, the money isn't coming from anywhere else. It's not coming from somebody else's savings account. That money is actually just new money that is created through the accounting process that the bank uses. This is a Bank of England paper saying the same thing. By far the largest role in creating broad money, so that's the money supply of the nation, is played by the banking sector. When banks make loans, they create additional deposits for those that borrowed the money. And this is one of the main financial journalists for the Financial Times of London, who just says the essence of the contemporary monetary system is the creation of money out of nothing by private banks, often foolish lending. So most of the money that exists is created by banks, and it's created when they make loans. And this is what has happened in Iceland with the amount of money in the economy. So you can see this red line down at the bottom is the money created by the central bank in the form of paper notes and coins. And then this blue line is the money created by the four main banks in Iceland through lending, through the accounting process that they use. And you can see how just in the few years before the financial crisis, this really expanded very quickly. The same thing happened in the UK. This is what happened over 40 years in the UK with the money created by banks. And again, in the last few years before the crisis, this money creation was faster than ever before in history. So if banks are creating all this money essentially out of nothing, who decides how that money is going to be used in the economy? And the reality is it's actually the boards of the banks, the people at the very top, who make decisions about, do we want this bank to invest in property or in real businesses, or do we want to invest in, for example, the financial markets? So this small number of people at the very top of some of the big banks is making decisions on how to allocate and how to spend about 97% of the money that exists. And in the UK in particular, most of this money didn't go to businesses, it didn't go to the real non-financial economy. 40% of all the money they created in the 10 years before the crisis went into housing. So obviously this pushed up house prices. 37% went into the financial markets. So the financial markets did very well. And just 13% went into businesses, into the real economy, the part that actually contributes to the GDP figures for the economy. And another 10% went into consumer loans and credit cards, personal loans. So almost 80% of all the money that banks were creating was going into financial markets and the property market. So what's the consequence of this? Well, firstly, if you give banks the power to create too much money, if you give banks the power to create money, they will create too much of it. Because the more money they create, the more loans they can make, and the more loans they make, the more interest and profits they receive on those loans. So they have an incentive to always try to create too much money. And this is what happens. They create that money for the wrong things. So most of the money that banks create goes into property and financial markets, and very little actually goes into the real economy. And this causes financial crises. And my organisation's been arguing for about 3 years that the financial crisis was caused by allowing banks to create money. Everybody else at the time was talking about other things like CDOs and or lending. But 4 weeks ago, the chairman of the Financial Services Authority in the UK actually said this. He said the financial crisis of 2008 occurred because we failed to constrain the private financial system's creation of private credit and money. So this idea that the crisis was caused by allowing banks to create money has now become mainstream, and it's been discussed in political circles and at the top of the main regulator in the UK. It also causes debt, because if banks create money when they make loans, then for every additional 1,000 kroners in the economy, there will also be 1,000 kroners of debt. And this is a chart for the UK, but you can see that the debt now is actually higher than the amount of money in the economy. This situation applies in essentially around the world. So as the amount of money goes up, the debt also rises. But then if people try to pay off the debt, then the amount of money will shrink in the economy as well. So then you have a recession. It also contributes to inequality, because all of the money that we're using has to be borrowed from the banking sector, and we have to pay interest on this borrowed money. In the UK, I'm sorry I don't have the figures for Iceland for this, but in the UK, this transfer of income from the public back to the big banks is between 108 billion and 217 billion pounds every year. So if you do that per person, it's about 450,000 kroners per person across the economy that is being paid back to the banking sector. And we've done studies on the effects of this, and what it does is it transfers money from the bottom 90% of the population to the very top 10%. So it's really making inequality worse. And it's also the reason why houses have become so expensive. We hear people arguing a lot of the time that houses are expensive because we haven't built enough of them. This is a situation in the UK, what politicians often argue. But the reality is that this purple line shows house prices over 20 years in the UK. The green line at the bottom is the number of people in the country, the population. And this red line, which is slightly above it, is the number of houses. So the amount of houses in the country was growing faster than the amount of people. So it's not that there's too many people that is making houses expensive. What the problem is this blue line at the top, which was mortgage lending. Now, remember that every loan that a bank makes creates new money. So all of this money that was going into property was newly created money that pushed up house prices. This is why house prices have become so expensive in the UK, in Iceland, in America, in most of Europe, and even the same thing is happening in China now. Banks have been allowed to create all this money. They put most of it into property because that's where they can get the quickest returns. And this is what happens to house prices. And obviously these house prices are growing much, much faster than people's salaries and people's ability to actually pay these prices. And it also has implications for the environment, because firstly, with banks deciding where to allocate all of the new money, they tend to go for the things that will give them the short-term profits, and that tends to be things like oil, often the arms industry. So they invest in things that might not be in the best interests of the environment or of society in the long term. Also, this monetary system causes crises, causes financial crises. When we have a financial crisis, possibly not so much here, but definitely in other countries, what happens is the government says, well, we can't afford to protect the environment right now because we have a financial crisis and we don't have enough money anymore. So all of these environmental protections and laws to protect the environment that have been developed over 10 or 20 years, when there's a financial crisis, the government tries to take all these away because they say they're too expensive. And there's also the fact that you have, some economists think that this current debt-based monetary system is causing something that they call forced growth, which means that we have to always keep the economy growing, even if that just leads to more debt and more environmental destruction, because there is so much debt that if businesses aren't growing and the economy isn't growing, it becomes impossible to continue paying the debt. And the debt exists because of the way that money is currently created by banks making loans. And then when you do have the financial crisis, it makes it really difficult to get the economy to recover. Because when money is created by banks when they make loans, it means that if you want to put more money into the economy, you have to try and get banks to lend more. That's the only real way of putting money into the economy. But the crisis was caused because people had too much debt. So we also want to reduce the debt. But if you want people to pay down their debts in the current system, then they'll do that using money which was created by banks. And when they use that money to pay off the debt, the amount of money in the economy starts to shrink. And this is when you get a recession. So we have a money supply where, a monetary system where we have to keep on taking more debt from banks to keep the money growing. And as soon as we stop increasing the level of debt, then the economy starts to shrink, to contract. What we need right now is we need to have less debt in the economy, but we also need to have more money to allow us to pay off that debt. And that's actually impossible because of the structure of the current monetary system. So we've been arguing, again, for the last 3 years in the UK that you can't solve this crisis by trying to get banks to lend more money to people who already have too much debt. And again, the chairman of the Financial Services Authority just 4 weeks ago said that the success of monetary policy depends in large part on persuading households to increase mortgage debt or businesses to borrow more money. We got into this mess because of excessive creation of private credit and money. We should be concerned if our only escape route implies building up a future excess. So the very policies that the central banks and governments have been using around the world to try and solve the crisis, like lowering interest rates and trying to encourage banks to lend more, is exactly what caused the crisis in the first place. And now Adair Turner at the Financial Services Authority is saying that if we do the same thing again now, this is only going to lay the foundations for the next financial crisis. So we need to do something different. And there are alternatives to this current monetary system. Again, Martin Wolf, who is probably the most credible journalist writing for the Financial Times, has been writing about this issue quite a lot, asking why is it that banks are committed to, are allowed to create all of the money for the economy when actually it's had such a harmful effect. What he said recently was, it is a normal monetary system in which the printing of money is delegated to commercial banks that needs spending. This delegates a core public function, the creation of money, to a private and often irresponsible commercial oligopoly. So even people who are part of the economics mainstream are now starting to question the way the current monetary system works. And again, Adair Turner, in the speech that he gave, talked about something that he calls overt money finance, which is completely economist jargon. But basically what he was saying is, instead of doing things like quantitative easing, which has happened in the US and the UK, of creating this money and putting it into financial markets, if you actually created this money and gave it to the government to spend into the economy, then it would go right into the real economy instead of the financial markets. And what that would do is that would create jobs and help the economy grow. So he was saying that if you actually put this money directly into people's pockets, essentially, through government spending, or actually just giving everybody a check for the money that was created, this would actually get the economy going much faster than all of the policies that the government has been using. So we have worked on this proposal over the last 3 years of how you can actually change this monetary system. And I'm just going to explain quickly how this works. The first step is to take this power that banks have to create money away from them. And the way you do this, I don't want to go into accounting and balance sheets and the technical details, but essentially, right now, because of the way the accounting works, when banks make loans, they can effectively do it by entering a new number into your bank account. What we would do is we would take this ability away through some technical changes that are made to the way they operate. And what would happen is, as a customer of a bank, when you go into your bank with your salary, you would have two options. You either say to the bank, look, I want this money to be kept safe. Or you say, I want you to take this money and invest it for me. And if you ask the bank to keep your money safe, then this would be kept in a special type of account, which would be basically like your current or checking account now. So you would still have a debit card, maybe a checkbook, and your salary would be paid into this account. But then the bank wouldn't be able to use that money for anything else. So it stays your money, and it just waits there until you decide to spend it or to move it to somewhere else. On the other hand, if you actually put your money into an investment account, which is like a savings account, then you're saying to the bank, okay, I know that you're going to go and invest this money somewhere in the economy. I know that there will be some risk. I don't expect the government to give me the money back if you lose the money. And what this does is it separates banks into the job of keeping money safe for people who want their money to be safe, and the job of investing money for those who want their money to be invested. And it makes banks into what most people think they are today. So they actually take money from savers and lend it to borrowers. This is completely different from the current system, where banks are actually creating new money to make the loans that they make. So then you need to take this power to create money away from the banks and then return it to some kind of transparent and accountable and democratic process. So what we suggest is, we know from history that you can't trust the banks with the power to create money because of what has happened over the last 5 or 6 years. But I guess most people wouldn't trust politicians either, because politicians would have the same reason to try and create too much money as the banks. They create lots of money before an election to boost the economy, and then afterwards this causes inflation and all these kinds of economic problems. So we can't just give politicians the power to create money either. What you need to do is separate two decisions. So the decision over how much new money you want to create, and the decision over how that money will be used, what it can be spent on. And what we suggest is that you have what we call a money creation committee, but this might be like the monetary policy committee at the central bank, the Bank of Iceland, that would look at the economy and say, okay, we need to increase the amount of money in the economy by 1 or 2% this year. They would create that money and then give that money to the government, and then the government could either spend it into the economy, or it could distribute it actually directly to citizens. And you need to make sure that that money is only created when inflation is low. So what happens at the moment is, when banks are creating money, it happens like this. They put more money into the system, and this pushes up prices. They think that that means the economy is healthy. So when they see house prices and things go up, they think, look, the economy is doing really well now, so we can afford to lend even more to housing. And the money supply starts expanding even faster. And some people start to say, well, this is a bubble, this is going to crash. But you get people arguing, no, everything's fine. And then you have the financial crisis. What would happen if the Bank of Iceland had responsibility for creating money and the banks didn't have this power? Is that they would put some money into the economy, and once it's caused inflation, they would need to stop until inflation starts to come down again. When it gets to zero, then you can put more money into the economy, and then you start creating money again. So instead of having this with the banks creating money, the line at the top, you would have a much lower increase in the money supply, and you wouldn't have all this new money flooding into financial markets and into property markets and pushing up house prices. So you would have a much more stable economy. And then the next thing is that when you create this money, so remember in the current monetary system, every new krona that comes into the economy comes with a krona of debt. So when banks are making loans, the debt and the money in the economy is going up at the same time. That means that there is debt for all the money that exists. And we have this problem that we need less debt and more money in the economy, but it's not possible in the current system. So this is the situation you have in the UK right now. The debt reached the maximum just after the financial crisis, and now as people are paying down debt, the money supply of the economy is shrinking as well. So this is like when you take the oil out of the engine of your car, pretty soon everything stops working, and you continue to have a recession. What the government is trying to do now is to get banks lending again, and that means that this will happen. The debt will go up and the money supply will go up again. And then in another 2 or 3 years we'll have another financial crisis because we did exactly the same thing that caused the first financial crisis. If you change the monetary system and you allow the central bank to create money without the debt attached, then actually you can change this relationship. So the money supply can keep increasing, but the debt can continue to fall as people pay off old debts and new money comes into the economy. And then instead of having this huge distribution of income from the bottom 90% to the top 10% through the banking sector, this would be significantly lower. It could be half of this. The level of debt could fall by about half or 60%. And then you need to put this money into the real economy. So right now banks create money and put most of it into property markets and financial markets. Neither of those markets contribute to GDP. So when you hear people talking about the economy growing, they're not talking about property or financial markets, they're talking about real jobs and real businesses in the high street, factories, small businesses that are outside of the financial sector. So in terms of how you get the money into the economy, you could either spend more on public services, you could cut taxes. A left-wing government would do the first option, a right-wing government would probably cut taxes. You could use it to pay down the national debt, or you could actually just divide the money up between the citizens and give everybody a check for their percentage. What this would do, whereas the current system works like this, most of the money is created by banks, goes into housing and financial markets, and then some of that money eventually reaches the real economy. And just about 10% of the money that banks create goes into the real economy. It will be different because the money would come from the Money Creation Committee, probably at the Bank of Iceland. It would go to the government. It would be spent into the real economy, and then businesses and people who work in the real economy, if they want to, can lend that money to the bank by putting it into an investment or savings account. And then the bank is able to lend it on to other people, either to housing or to financial markets, or back to other parts of the real economy. Okay, and then the final thing that we need to do is give ourselves, as customers of banks, some kind of control and transparency over how our money is used. So right now you put your money into the bank and you don't know anything about what's happening to that money. The government says if the bank loses your money, we'll use taxpayers' money to give you your money back. What we would like to see is that the bank would actually need to tell you, okay, if you put your money into this account, we're going to use it in the stock market in New York. And because of this, the risk will be this high. Or if you put it into this account, we'll use it for businesses in Iceland, in which case the risk will be much lower. And you actually have transparency over how that money is used and how much risk has been taken. If you don't want your money to be used for the arms industry, for example, the bank would need to tell you if they're going to use it for that, and you have the option to say, you know, I don't want to use this account, give me something else. Okay. So just to recap that, first thing to do is remove the power of banks to create money. You need to return that power to a transparent and accountable body. You create this money free of debt so that you can reduce the private household debt whilst the money supply continues to go up. You only create money when inflation is low. This is in contrast to what banks do at the moment, which is create money as quickly as they can until there's a financial crisis. You need to make sure that this new money goes into the real economy instead of financial markets, and you do that by spending the money into the economy through government spending or either distributing it directly to people instead of allowing banks to create this money from property in financial markets. And then give customers control and transparency over how their money is invested. So this sounds like, to economists who have studied the existing system and been taught that this is the natural way for a banking system to work, this all sounds very radical. But actually we're not as radical as a paper from the International Monetary Fund, which recently came out and suggested the same kind of reform. They use something called DSG economic modelling, which I won't explain, but it's essentially the very complicated economic models that the International Monetary Fund and organisations like the World Bank and the main economists use to predict what will happen to the economy. What they say is that if you take this power to create money away from the banks, you get much better control of business cycles. So you don't have this boom-bust economy that we've had for the last few decades. You don't have bank runs because the people that wanted their money to be safe know that their money is always there, actually in the bank, and kept safe. You get a big fall in the national debt, and you get an increase in the economic growth by about 10%. So actually this is, you know, it sounds radical, but the International Monetary Fund even has done some work on this and found that this will be beneficial for the economy and would actually work much more effectively than the proposals that governments are currently proposing. So this is the proposal that is outlined in the book. You can also get a much shorter version from the Positive Money website. And I think I'll stop there. Thank you.